Hello and welcome to today's webinar on navigating UK sustainability reporting. We are going to be taking a deep dive into UK climate-related financial disclosures. My name is Helena. I am one of Agendi's managing partner, and I am joined by my fabulous colleague, Victoria, and also Tristan from Sust Global. And we're really excited to bring forward this second part of our three-part series, where we're going to deep dive into what it takes to progress a climate-related financial disclosure. They've been mandated for some time in the UK. So what we're looking at is how far you've come, what's coming around the corner, and how you can move towards a higher level of quantification and integration within your strategy. Brilliant. But first up, a quick introduction to Agendi, then I'll pass over to the Sust Global team. Agendi is a specialist climate consulting firm and sustainability. We have operations in the US, Canada, Europe, and of course here in the UK. We support organizations of all sizes, all sectors, and we focus on large listed global organizations. And as you can see here, we deliver solutions across the full range of sustainability services, including strategy development, execution of that strategy, and of course, the topic and focus for today is reporting and disclosure, and bundling all that analysis up into preparing for your climate-related financial disclosures. Throughout this webinar, in particular, we're going to deep dive and step through some of the key areas to progress your climate-related financial disclosure. We're going to be touching on key implementation areas such as the governance, capacity building, the evaluation of climate-related risks and opportunities, particularly leaning on Sust Global to bring this piece from the physical risk component. And then, of course, integration into your existing risk management, building those mitigation strategies and wrapping all of that up in terms of disclosure drafting. Brilliant. Maybe, Tristan, I'll hand over to you for a quick introduction, and we've got you sandwiched in the middle to do a deep dive and some really fabulous case studies.
Yes, thank you, Helena. My name is Tristan. I'm a senior climate data scientist at Sust Global, and I'll be getting into more detail in a bit, but briefly, Sust Global is a climate risk analytics company, and we help translate these complex climate model simulations of the future into more actionable either analytics or solutions for the end user.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And as I said, this is part of a three-part series. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into climate-related financial disclosures. Just 1 week ago, we provided a comprehensive guide to current and emerging UK standards. We've got the recording available, so please reach out if you would like to get hold of that recording. And then coming up in 2 weeks' time, we're going to deep dive into the secondary piece, which is building out that transition plan. We've got a fabulous guest speaker coming along for that, looking at financing mechanism and instruments and integrating that into your financial planning. Brilliant. So moving on, and of course, focusing on today's climate-related financial disclosure deep dive. The goal of this webinar is to support sustainability managers and associated teams with both preparing and enhancing existing climate-related disclosures. It's been mandated for some time. We're not considering this a generalist overview, but what we're looking at is what you need to consider to progress and enhance and move towards the financial quantification and the level of granularity in those disclosures that are expected with incoming regulation, such as the UK's expected endorsement of ISSB. So we'll start with a quick flash of the overarching context for climate risk consideration, the UK requirements, and then we're going to walk you through the key steps on building a sustainability disclosure roadmap. So that's looking at a regulations gap analysis, understanding your level of ambition, planning out that disclosure roadmap, looking at the role of governance and making sure that your governance framework can support your level of ambition and the disclosure planning. And then, of course, deep diving into scenario analysis and business impact. And we'll be leaning on Tristan for that area in terms of the physical risk assessment. Then looking at those metrics, plannings, working that into your strategic plans of your overarching goals. And then finally, looking at the disclosure drafting. We're hoping to leave some time for Q&A. I can't promise that would necessarily be the case. We've got some really great content today, but we do have our email addresses on the last slide. More than happy to get to any questions should we run out of time. This session is recorded and we'll be sharing both the slides and the recording as we go along. Brilliant. So as I said, a quick flash, what we know in terms of where we're situated in relation to our emissions trajectory. With our current actions, we are likely to exceed the safe levels of warming, the 1.5 degrees. Now, of course, that comes with an uncertain future and high emissions and cascading impacts across society with food yield, increased challenges in terms of food security, diseases, etc. And one of the challenging aspects of what makes climate so different is that it's nonlinear. We do have potential irreversible tipping points that come in at various temperatures, creating an irreversible step change in how we respond to climate. When we move on to the World Economic Forum, in terms of the risk, what we can see within the space of their forward-looking piece on the 10 years risk, climate and nature, biodiversity are taking a forefront in terms of the key risks. And of course, all of this comes at a projected immense impact in terms of our GDP, looking at 4.2 trillion, potentially 4% change and reduction in GDP. So all of these costs, when we bring that down to a corporate organizational level, potentially these impacts of the physical impact of climate change, we're looking at reduced revenue, increase in capital costs, increase in operating costs and financing costs, just to name a few. Now, of course, one of the challenges with climate change is that regardless of the future that we face, we are likely to see some level of risk. We can move on to the next slide. And so, of course, when we're looking at the physical impacts of climate, some of those we are already seeing to a great degree with recent flooding, Florida severe weather events, and even in a more optimistic future, we're likely to face a series of transition risks across policy and legal, technology, market, and reputation. So regardless of the future that we face, organizations need to plan in terms of managing that risk. I'll hand over here to Victoria.
Thank you, Helena, and also hello from my side. I walk you now to what is TCFD, how it's embedded in the UK regulation, and what the future will bring in terms of regulation, especially in the UK. So what is TCFD? TCFD was founded 2017. It is a task force on climate-related financial disclosure. I guess a lot of people are familiar with the framework. If not, I give a very brief overview so that you can know what it is on a high level before we go into more detail. So TCFD is a framework that has those four categories you see on the left-hand side: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. It's highly valued by external stakeholders. And, well, the FSB in the UK has announced that the work of the TCFD is complete. However, the TCFD will not disappear because, as I said, it's embedded in regulation, and the responsibility will be taken over, or is taken over, by the ISSB, so the IFRS. What does it mean for UK regulations? So in the UK regulations, you see here in the middle side, we have TCFD kind of split into two regulations. So the climate-related financial disclosure, which is essentially the TCFD part without the metrics and targets part. And then we have SECA, so the streamlined energy and carbon reporting part, which is focusing on the metrics and targets part of TCFD. You will find the different thresholds here slightly simplified because it depends what type of company you are. But in general, for climate-related financial disclosure, you have a bit of a higher threshold for employees, and then depending on the type of company, also of turnover that you can see here, where you have a lower threshold for SECA reporting. And one thing that is important to mention is that these UK disclosures, they are based on TCFD. They're not 100% mirrored, but mostly mirrored, let's say. So it makes sense to look at the framework and then look at the specific UK regulations. There can be some mapping done. And then, as I said earlier, the ISSB, so the International Sustainability Standards Board, frameworks took over the responsibilities of the TCFD, and it will be or is integrated into the IFRS S1 and S2 related disclosure. It's expected in the UK to be endorsed officially in Q1 of 2025. So when we look briefly at this timeline, you can see, of course, we used as a starting point here the Paris Agreement from 2015. You see the TCFD publication in 2017. A lot of steps to endorse TCFD and bring up different disclosure requirements within the UK. Until then, in 2022, the climate-related financial disclosure requirements have been published. Important part to mention here, also the integration within the European regulations. And then looking forward, the 2025 expected UK endorsement of ISSB to form the SDR, to integrate also the transition plan task force. That's why we decided to do a specific third webinar on the transition plan to highlight and go into more detail for those requirements. And now I hand it back to Helena to walk you through the roadmap.
Fabulous. As I said, a quick flash in terms of the context, because what we're hoping to do is focus on this roadmap in terms of progressing the disclosures. So what we have here is the simplified 7 key steps in terms of submitting and preparing your UK climate-related financial disclosure. As I said before, we always start off with a regulations gap analysis, understanding what are the requirements. There's many that are on a comply or explain basis. There's many that can be phased in. There's some which are considered best practice. In terms of building out your analysis and disclosure, that needs to be understood from the outset of the project. Now, of course, within step 2, there's an element of ambition, assessment, and planning that disclosure. Where do you want to be in terms of future-proofing your business? We know that ISSB is likely to be endorsed within the UK, but how far is your organization ready to go in terms of preparing for that? Of course, the governance framework needs to address those gaps, make sure that there's sufficient sign-off. So that's a key element. And then, of course, understanding what are the risks and opportunities in relation to your business and what is the associated business impact, ideally from a financial perspective, of exposure to those particular risks. So what we'll be looking at there is both the physical high emission scenario, but also a more optimistic future scenario looking at transition risks. Then, of course, taking all of that data, we then need to feed that into the strategic planning, making sure that we've identified a long-term goal, associated metrics, KPIs to track the evolution of that risk or opportunity, and then bundling all of that up in terms of disclosure planning. So moving on, we'll run through each of these 7 steps, and we'll be passing between the 3 of us here so we can get some varied perspectives on each of those elements. But starting with the regulations gap analysis, what we recommend and how we support clients at Agendi is certainly looking at all of the relevant disclosure requirements and best practice guidance that come associated with a climate-related financial disclosure. So, of course, there is the UK climate disclosure requirements themselves. As Victoria mentioned earlier, that's largely mapped and mirrored to the TCFD framework. Of course, we have that emissions component sitting under SECA, but essentially if you take TCFD and SECA combined, you get the final piece. The FRC, of course, releases a series of thematics and best practice guidance, which should be incorporated into your disclosure. But again, many of those are on a comply or explain basis. So what you need to do is itemize and list down all of the very granular requirements sitting in those items to make sure that you can plan your disclosures in terms of the future. And of course, there's a number of other key documents that we suggest and we support clients in terms of doing that gap analysis and preparing that maturity roadmap to define your disclosure plan. Forward-looking, of course, many of the UK companies are very likely to come under CSRD if they have European operations. And as we said earlier, UK is expected to endorse the ISSB. So forward-looking and starting to look at some of those enhanced metrics and requirements and understanding what that means for your business, what type of additional data do you need to collect, what actions may you be potentially deficient in. And of course, the original TCFD documents are still valid, they're still withstanding, there's still plenty of excellent guidance in terms of progressing your disclosures as well. And then with the role of auditors, there can be other additional requirements coming down. And for any of those organizations that have a global presence, starting to think about how these requirements and climate-related disclosures are being mandated at a country level is certainly important to make sure that your company's disclosures are harmonized, there's a consistent story that's being told throughout them. And of course, any of those figures on a global level are consistent. So moving on, in terms of what that potentially looks like, what I have here is essentially a very, very simplified screenshot of how we look to do a gap analysis. Essentially, we take all of those requirements, itemize those down to understand at a very granular level all of the key steps, the key items, and then what we recommend to do is to map that out in terms of what is your data maturity, how prepared are you in terms of your actions and policy, so the readiness towards that, and then what is the current level of disclosure? And so, of course, what we can do once we understand that gap analysis, we can essentially build together a very robust and clear disclosure roadmap so you can understand both the short, medium, and long-term actions, data, analysis, all of those elements that have to go towards progressing your disclosure. Brilliant. I think I'll hand back here to Victoria, who will run through the next step.
Perfect. So the next steps we want to look at is ambition assessment and disclosure planning. We have this 4 steps here for you. So when we look at the baseline compliance, we focus on meeting the minimum regulatory requirements. For the enhanced disclosure, we're working towards a more detailed and granular disclosure. For strategic integration, so step number 3, we look at the integration of sustainability considerations across business strategy, some utilization of technology solutions and enhancing data quality. And then future-proofing, 4th step here is proactively preparing for future regulations, so ISSB integration, for example, and market expectations. I'm not going through all of the detailed points here, but I want to highlight a few. So, for example, when you look at scenario analysis, you will see that kind of the baseline compliance would be a qualitative scenario analysis, and then with more and more ambitious disclosure, you would also look at quantitative scenario analysis using really like location-based data solutions like Sust Global, for example, for the physical data. In additional step afterwards, so you're looking now at strategic integration here already and future-proofing, is to really understand, analyze, and estimate the financial impacts of the potential impact those risks might have on your business. So that's one point to highlight. Of course, emission disclosure, as mentioned before, is a separate regulation with SECA in the UK. You will see that to meet the regulation, you have to disclose scope 1, 2, and scope 3 business travel. So that's really like the baseline compliance. And then, of course, to move forward, you would do a full greenhouse gas inventory also for scope 3, limited assurance, moving forward then into the strategic integration phase. So a few to highlight here. Happy to answer more questions later on you might have on those specific steps and those specific ambition levels. I want to quickly move on to step number 3, climate governance framework. Of course, when we look, we have listed here 3 of potential frameworks for climate governance: TCFD, CDP, and World Economic Forum recommendations. So when we look at the TCFD one, of course, those are integrated in the UK regulations. So those should be looked at first, so that you really describes your board's oversight on climate-related risk and opportunities, and also the management role in assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. CDP is mapped to TCFD, however, have a few additional questions, let's say here. They're asking, for example, for board competency on environmental issues as well, and also asked to disclose incentives for management that are related with climate-related issues. When you look at the third one, to the World Economic Forum, they published 8 guiding principles for effective climate governance on corporate board level. So you see a lot of overlapping points here. For example, of course, the climate accountability, the structure itself. They speak about materiality assessment, of course, incentivization. Sorry, can't say this word properly, but you can see that in CDP as well, and in the World Economic Forum, reporting and disclosure as well. Moving on to the next step, the scenario analysis and impact part, where I will hand over back to Helena for the integration, for the overview of this part.
Fabulous. Thanks, Victoria. And as I was saying earlier on, one of the key areas in terms of progressing those disclosures is making sure that we're shifting from a qualitative scenario analysis to a quantitative scenario analysis. The role of scenario analysis within these climate-related disclosures is essentially, it's critical, because what we're doing is we're taking various future states of the world and evaluating what does that look like for a particular organization. Now, of course, there's different risks posing for both a high emissions scenario. We have the physical risk, and then a low emissions, a more optimistic scenario. Of course, that comes with potentially disruptive policies and behavioral requirements that may have knock-on impacts for your organization. So in terms of what we recommend when you're looking at scenario analysis, the first step is, of course, to consider a wide range of scenarios. Of course, starting from a physical risk perspective, we certainly recommend the IPCC scenarios, and I'm sure Tristan will be deep diving into that. And then some of the other key areas you can look at in terms of applying those scenarios is the World Energy Outlook. Within the next couple of weeks, we have the launch for the IEA's World Energy Outlook 2024. We, of course, have the Network for the Greening the Financial System, and then the Inevitable Policy Response, to name just a few. And what's important, and what we often recommend when we work with clients, is to make sure that that particular scenario speaks to your long-term goals of your organization. So if you have a long-term goal in terms of a net zero target, then of course you should be looking at a net zero future and what that means for your organization, to tease out and understand all of those different scenarios and what those potential risks and opportunities might be. And then when we come on to selecting the boundary for climate-related scenario analysis, what's important is that you're not just looking at your direct operations. Of course, that's important from a physical risk perspective, is to understand those location-based specifics. But what you also need to be considering is your entire value chain. So, of course, looking at your strategy, whether or not that is compliant with our global climate goals, any partnerships that you may have. Are you looking at the trajectory of that expected partnership, what that might look like in terms of additional financing costs or risks or opportunities in relation to that scenario? Looking at your value chain in terms of key suppliers and all those operations and the climate strategy of your critical suppliers, are they resilient under those future varying scenarios? Could you potentially be looking at any pass-through costs expected by those suppliers should they not be prepared to the level required? And then thinking about the role of customers and whether or not there may be any changing customer preferences or adjustments in terms of their purchasing habits in relation to regulations, etc. And then, of course, looking at their own climate-related targets, could you potentially receive any changes to their purchasing habits or any particular demands to ensure that your customers can meet their own climate-related targets? And then the last piece, of course, wrapped up is whether or not you've explored the temperature alignment of any investments that you may have. Of course, looking at investments within your organization, but also external investments and understanding what that looks like in both of those different scenarios. And of course, not just the polar extremes of stress testing the maximum in terms of physical and transition risk, but also looking at what may be a more moderated scenario, which of course is a combination of both physical risks and transition risks. So I think this is a really great moment to hand over to Tristan here, who's going to do a bit of a deep dive in terms of the scenario analysis from a physical risk perspective. I'm particularly looking forward to some really great case studies on flood analysis here.
Terrific. Thank you, Helena. Yeah, as she's mentioned, I'm going to be covering how we take these complex climate model simulations and help enable physical risk assessment for sustainability managers, as well as asset owners and asset investors, not just for compliance, but also all the way up the chain to acting strategically in the face of climate change and also future-proofing your organization. So let's see. Yeah, at our core, we use climate model simulations and climate model data. But we build on top of that various analytics to help you actually understand the risk at your location. Beyond that, the data, we try our best to make it open and as transparent as possible. We publish our methods openly and our models openly. And that's important as well for some of these regulations that the data you use for your reports be open and credible. Yeah, let's jump in the next slide. Okay, so for a brief overview of what I'm going to be covering today, part of it is this physical data that we provide to enable these climate risk disclosures across different climate scenarios, different timeframes, and a suite of climate hazards, as well as some of the quickly emerging opportunities with AI and various other geospatial advancements, primarily satellite data that's been coming online. And then 2 different case studies to kind of help you see this demo for you at like a particular asset, what this might look like. First for flood risk in Central Europe, and then next for wildfire risk and also hurricane risk, cyclone risk in Australia for a railroad network. Yeah, first I wanted to start with this slide. It's kind of how we think about enabling understanding and using physical climate risk. So at its core is the tip of the iceberg is the reporting component. It's just understanding, what is your organization's physical risk and disclosing it. But we do see this tremendous opportunity underneath the substance of the iceberg, which is what do you actually do with that information? How do you think strategically? Now that you know your risk, how do you act in response to that? How do you make wise investment decisions, balancing all those different risks? And also we're seeing more interesting things like balancing biodiversity concerns or water usage concerns. So balancing all these components at once for your organization. Okay, so for an overview of the types of data that we provide, the different layers. So first, you've heard a little bit about it today is the climate scenarios. there are more than three, but typically use these three climate scenarios provided by the IPCC. These are standardized, the IPCC is from the United Nations. These are standardized climate scenarios for the future. You can think of them as a bundling of various hypotheses of how society will develop in the coming decades. And that has things from GDP and population growth all the way down to the resulting carbon emissions. And those resulting carbon emissions are what are used to drive these different climate models all the way out to 2100 and beyond in some cases. And then for the different time horizons, most of these models are run at all the way out to 2100, some out to 2300. But realistically, most businesses care about the 30-year to 50-year time frame. So we typically provide our data for baseline data. So what is your current risk today? That's partly based on climate model simulations, but also based off of satellite observations of what your risk has been historically. Then to compare that against it, we have two other scenarios. One is a more short-term or near-term scenario out to 2050, and then for longer-term planning out to 2080. All right, and then this is a lot of information, but I'm just including all of it for completeness. We cover 6 main hazards: flooding, inland and coastal flooding, wildfires, cyclones or hurricanes. We're in the midst of a Cat 5 about to hit Florida right now. It's an exciting time to be a climate scientist, but it is also a scary time to be a climate scientist. We also cover heat waves, sea level rise, and water stress. So we can serve those raw data sets of what is the sea level rise in meters going to be. Certain users will want that granularity of data, but more often, particularly for these disclosure reports, you're interested on layers on top of that. So what do those actually mean for your business? So how do you translate cyclone risk into damage to your property and expected losses and business interruption if your factory has to go offline for flooding, for example? And here's just a snapshot of what our platform looks like, or can look like as well. So this is looking at a company that's on the S&P 500. We did an analysis of its flood risk. So we can cover assets globally for all the hazards, not just in the UK and Europe and the US, but globally. And we can zoom in and we can see various projections of what their risk is for structural damage, but also business interruption layers. Great. So I wanted to give 2 case studies diving into these a little bit more. One of them is flooding, which is, I know, top of mind in the UK. I think you just had some pretty nasty floods last week. But then there's also been tremendous flooding this entire summer across Europe. Both of the flooding events are expected to cost in the multiple billions of euros. So I'm going to be looking at the Germany flooding today. So here's an example of what a town, Hagen, Germany, that experienced pretty substantial flooding. And I put in asset into our platform to take a look at what their flood risk looks like. And here's an example of what that actually looks like. So you see pretty decent baseline historical risk. And then for those different time horizons that we laid out, you can see that the risk is increasing pretty substantially into the future as a result of climate change. And then under the hood, what's actually happening is we're running our in-house climate model that integrates various aspects of topography, soil types, the precipitation patterns, the temperature patterns. We feed all this into a relatively complex computer simulation flood model, and that will predict flood risk at a 90-meter grid cell resolution. And we also bias correct the data and validate it using flood hazard maps from various national organizations, FEMA for the US, it's also other organizations in the UK and Spain. Yeah, and then very high resolution. The key for flooding is high resolution topography data. So we use satellite data for that as well from NASA and other sensors. Beyond that raw flood risk, if you actually want to understand what will the damage be at your asset, it's really helpful if you know what the actual asset type is. So we have a growing bank of 240 plus damage impact functions, which will tell you for a given set of flooding, a given flood depth, what is your expected damage to the property? So those will clearly be different for agriculture versus light industry versus a single family home, as I'm showing here. Cool. And then this is for the data nerds. I included this slide. You don't have to understand all of it, but looking at that asset in Germany, you have a certain amount of flood risk. That's the blue line on the left. And then to get to the final curves you're seeing on the right, these other curves under the hood are happening as well. So you use any potential damage function from that damage bank that we have. They're slightly different. And then you can integrate it, and you see there's slightly different. It's a little hard to make out with these bar charts, but you see that there's can be a pretty substantial difference in risk. The single family dwellings have a much higher flood risk and I guess I say flood susceptibility, not flood risk, susceptibility compared to light industry in this example. Great, and then shifting gears, going kind of fast, but in the interest of time, I just want to cover as much as possible. So here's a different example looking at Australia, a fun analysis we did of a railroad network there. Australia has bushfires every year in different parts of the country, but they've been having some pretty devastating fires on the eastern side of the country, and especially the southeast and New South Wales that have been pretty intense, especially in 2020. Cool. So this is an example of this Horizon rail network. So it's a kind of an interesting, from a data scientist perspective, data challenge for how do you model this type of a linear continuous segment on top of a global sphere. But I won't necessarily get into that here, but we split it up into different segments and look at the risk along each of those segments. So you could imagine if you are the owner of this railway network, or if you depend on it in any way for your supply chain, it would be really helpful to know at which points is it vulnerable to climate risk. And this one, we're kind of interested in wildfire. Obviously, there's other hazards that might impact it, but wildfire is a main one in Australia. And this, we run an in-house wildfire model. We have a publication there if you're interested in learning more about it, but it incorporates land cover, satellite data on past burn information, as well as climate model simulations, and then AI model to help make more accurate and more local projections of wildfire risk at 300-meter global resolution. This is just a view of that wildfire model output. So the left is the baseline risk, and the right is the change going into the future. And this is something that, one of the reasons why we have to do these reports is there's substantial increases in wildfire risk in the future due to largely more dry conditions, a lot of locations. Cool. So wrapping up this case study a little bit, we can flag on the left image, it's kind of doing a stoplight system, a red, green, red, yellow, blue, red, yellow, green situation for low, medium, and high risk. So you can flag the locations that are higher risk and zoom in on them and get more information. I think this is the last one for this case study. So you can zoom in on a particular asset and see what its risk profile looks like. And here, the orange is the wildfire risk. And you see that it faces pretty substantial wildfire risk at this location. But it's actually kind of interesting for this one, not increasing dramatically over time in the future. The driver of the increase is actually increasing hurricane risk, cyclone risk. So it's actually kind of an interesting asset. That one surprised me when I pulled it up. Yeah, I wanted to close on this before passing it off. We see this as a tremendous opportunity to help organizations understand their climate risks. we're past the point of wondering whether climate change will be a problem, and now we're at a point where companies are realizing these are multi-billion-dollar loss events that are happening all the time. We're having 2 Category 5 hurricanes in the US within the span of a month. And businesses are coming to realizing they need to understand that and also turn it into an opportunity. We love working with Agendi for helping customers figure that out, use our data effectively.
Okay, thank you so much, Tristan, for this interesting insights into the physical risk simulations and how much detail you can provide. I'm happy to take it back over and look at the strategic planning next. We integrated here the transition risk as well in that segment. So coming here to the transition risk and the strategic integration of those, the quantification, we have some example financial metrics listed here and also have opportunities. So a lot to cover on this slide, but I'll walk you through. So when we look at policy and legal first, so policy and legal, what you can expect under this is, for example, increased pricing of greenhouse gas emissions, enhanced emissions reporting obligations. Of course, we see the UK will increase regulations beginning of next year. The EU just integrated CSRD. There are upcoming additional regulations and globally as well. So definitely increased regulations. Exposure to litigation is a factor to include here as well under this bracket. So when we look at financial metrics for risk, specifically for policy and legal, what we can think about is, of course, reduced profits from increased compliance costs, write-offs, for example, early retirement of assets if they are not fulfilling regulations anymore, or potential expensive refit outs, increased production costs due to changing output requirements, and civil litigation costs here from insufficient climate action. We, of course, often when you hear TCFD, when you hear people talking about the regulation, it's often focused on the risk, but we don't want to forget about the opportunities, of course, as well. So we have included here, for example, sourcing of renewables in general, cost savings from energy efficiencies, so to make your, depending on the business, on your business, your offices or your production or both, more energy efficient. If we look at technology here, we can think about, for example, substitution of existing products and services with lower emission options. We can, of course, on a downside or risk side, look at unsuccessful investment in new tech, cost to transition to lower emissions tech. And what we can see here is potential financial metrics for risks are write-offs and early retirements of assets, R&D expenditure for new technologies, costs to adopt new technologies, and so on. Of course, also opportunities related to it. So when we look at like new growth industries, new model innovations for technology, process and production improvements to make it more efficient, and enhanced resiliency through technology. As a third point we want to look at here is market. Of course, market is changing. I think when we think about changing customer behavior, a lot of people often think about B2C businesses, but it's also certainly true for B2B businesses, especially if you have science-based targets in place and you're a supplier for a company with science-based targets in place. They, of course, want you as a supplier also to reduce your emissions. Uncertainty in market signals and increased costs of raw materials we have listed here. What we can look at for potential financial metrics are reduced revenue from customers switching to other more sustainable products, increased production cost due to changing input prices, in changing requirements for the output. Of course, we also see opportunities here. So increased revenue then, of course, through access to new markets, development and expansion of low emission goods and services, and access to public sector incentives. Last but not least, we want to look at reputation here. Reputation, for example, stigmatization of sectors, shift in consumer preferences, and increased stakeholder concern or negative stakeholder feedback. When we look at financial metrics, we can look at reduced revenue from decreased demand for specific higher emissions goods and services with a higher emissions, higher carbon intensity, reduction in capital availability, so financial or financing risks here included as well. However, we can of course also look at the opportunity side here, to have access to like climate related financing. And also one point that, well, is a risk and opportunity at the same time, we don't want to forget, especially when we look in the workforce, we see the importance of climate actions for new employees. So of course, there's an opportunity to recruit workforce, retain them, and develop them further. One thing I also want to mention, what is not on the slide here. So what you can do, of course, as part of your transition analysis, is also to use quantitative estimates on carbon pricing and analyze the impacts on your direct emissions, indirect emissions, so scope 1 and 2, and also on relevant scope 3 categories. And overall, you should focus, of course, on increased resiliency and reduced risk of business interruption, and really analyze your transition risks. What are the financial implications of those transition and of the physical risks that Tristan mentioned before, but what are also the related opportunities you have. Coming to the disclosure drafting, coming towards the end slowly of the webinar. So the disclosure recommendations. So you have to include your disclosure in the non-financial in sustainability information statement within the strategic report of your annual report. You should present your disclosure very clearly without requiring any references to other company sources. Everything within the annual report can of course be linked, but should be presented within the annual report. There's no specific format that is required. It's just important to clarify, of course, that you addressed all of the key disclosure requirements, and that you, of course, when you publish according to the UK regulations, that you reference the Companies Act instead of the TCFD framework, because that's where it's integrated within the UK regulations. And now for the last part, and to wrap us up, I hand it over back to Helena.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Victoria. So it looks like we will have some time for Q&A, which is fabulous. So there's a Q&A box. Please drop any questions. We're happy to answer any of those offline as well. We understand that some of this can sometimes go into more sensitive topics. So happy to answer one-to-one. But in terms of the key takeaways in progressing and enhancing your climate-related disclosures, first up, what we recommend, and that was within the roadmap that we developed, which is to plan your analysis and disclosure by reviewing against key guidance and requirements documents. So take all of those documents, understand what's relevant, and build out a disclosure and analysis plan. As Tristan was saying, some of the scenario analysis components, we're looking very far out into the future. So you don't necessarily need to repeat that year on year unless there's material changes to your asset locations or the underlying science. One of the other key areas that Victoria went through, which is ensuring that your governance processes match the required risk management and reporting sign-off. So some of the key disclosure requirements are looking at the competency of your competency of your board and the governance, the frequency that those discussions are happening. So making sure that you're tracking all of those key elements and you have the effective sign-off based on the level of analysis and the depth of disclosure that you're tracking towards. Of course, when we come on to climate-related scenario analysis, we don't know what the future will bring. So looking at various future states of the world, so applying numerous climate scenarios so that you can understand what happens in various states of the world so that hopefully you can progress for the worst case, the best case scenario, and you're also prepared for anything in between. We always recommend to take off-the-shelf scenarios. Of course, I would love to predict the future and define my own scenario, but essentially what's credible for your organization is to understand and apply some of those existing scenarios, and that brings forward consistency in terms of the stakeholders that are utilizing these disclosures. As Tristan detailed, it absolutely makes sense to leverage data solutions. What we want to understand is not a generic expected disclosure, but what is happening at that specific location in terms of both the exposure to those hazards as well as those expected impacts. And when we come on to looking at from a transition perspective, of course, that requires a very bespoke modeling of what's relevant in terms of your business. As Victoria mentioned, carbon pricing is one of the main levers in terms of pulling into terms of meeting our climate goals, and that can be used as a potential quantitative analysis. What we're tracking towards is ultimately financial quantification of what that impact opportunity is in terms of financial values for your organization. And of course, once we have that, incorporating those results into your strategy, your financial planning, and ultimately building resilience and harnessing those opportunities. All of this is a very fast-paced, evolving area. So what we do know is that if you prepare for those incoming regulations, so we're expected to endorse the ISSB here in the UK. So taking those requirements which are already publicized and understanding what does that look like for your business, how prepared are you, and then you can prepare for that incoming disclosure. I'm not sure if you want to add any other key takeaways from a data physical risk perspective here, Tristan. Otherwise, we can jump to some of the Q&A.
I think that was a great summary. I would just say it's an exciting time from a data scientist perspective, just because there are so many new sources of data coming online, be it from satellites and all the data that provides to these new AI solutions that are really changing the game across science, but especially in climate modeling and weather forecasting.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tristan. Lovely. Let's take a look at some of the Q&As. Victoria, maybe I'll pass this one on to you. Would you recommend that a company starts with qualitative scenario analysis and then transitions to quantitative analysis, or would you recommend that that be done simultaneously?
Yeah, I think, well, it depends, which is not a great answer, but I would say it depends on your ambitions. I think for kind of now, the qualitative analysis is kind of just good enough. So it's a baseline. If you do like qualitative analysis 1 year and then the next year you integrate it with the quantitative, because it's easier for your company, easier for your internal resource thing. I would personally say that's absolutely fine, but try to get the quantitative analysis in there as soon as you can. So if you have like very high ambitions, let's say you're kind of early stage with sustainability at the moment, but you have high ambitions to increase it quickly, I would include the quantitative part as soon as you can, basically.
And maybe just jumping on from that, one of the key areas that we discuss with clients is you don't know where to deep dive if you haven't evaluated all areas at a high level. So in terms of a physical risk perspective, if you are and if you have the chance to look at your entire portfolio of assets in year one, that can give you an identification of areas that you need to deep dive, additional data that you need to track to understand how those risks are evolving over time. So if you can, we certainly recommend to do so at a quantitative level. And, if you're using a solution such as Sust Global, you certainly have the flexibility to apply multiple climate scenarios and take that out to a time horizon that makes sense for your business. Some of the other solutions that we have also worked with may restrict the application of time horizons, but what's fabulous about Sust Global is you have year-on-year exposure data to those particular hazards so that you can consolidate those hazards and the exposure data into meaningful time horizons for your business and fully integrate that into your existing risk management systems. Because ultimately, this is not a standalone exercise. The goal is to incorporate this data into your existing risk tracking and management systems. Don't know if you want to add anything there, Tristan. Apologies, I spoke a little bit for Sust Global there.
No, nothing to add. That was terrific. Thank you.
Brilliant. I think we've got time for one more question. Which of the upcoming disclosures are most important to follow? Maybe Victoria, I'll throw that one to you again.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the reason why we included this first step in our roadmap, what we called regulations gap analysis. So to first of all understand what you have to disclose, maybe also understand where you're kind of close to the threshold, so that you're not surprised once you reach it and have to disclose. So that's the first step, understanding what is clearly mandatory and what you have to do. And then also understand what is upcoming. We talked about ISSB, we talked about next year disclosure, about transition plan being integrated into ISSB. So those are definitely things that are upcoming. They're not clearly defined yet. The frameworks were out there, the adoption is unclear, but something to be prepared for and to have a look at as well. But if you're early stage, start with what is out there, what you have to do, where you're close to the threshold, and then look at the future reporting requirements.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that concludes our session. We'll be more than happy to send the recording, the slide materials, and what you'll see here. We've got our email addresses. So if we didn't get to any of your questions or you have a more in-depth question, we're more than happy to answer those offline. So thank you very much for your time today. And hopefully we look forward to speaking in the future. And hopefully you'll be joining our next webinar on transition planning. Thank you so much, all.
Thanks, everyone.